So great to have you today here on the show.
Hi, Danny. Thank you for the invitation.
Yes. So, Misal AI, tell us maybe a little bit more about the name. It's not such a usual name.
No, indeed, and it's quite hard to find a name for a startup. But we brainstormed a lot, and one evening I was reading a story to my daughter about
Mm-hmm.
two stars, actually, Mizal and Alcor, which is basically when you take a close look at the second star on the big Ursa, you will see that actually it's two stars kind of really really close together.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, oh, it's really about when you look closely at things, you discover new perspectives, new ideas. And that's basically, what we're trying to build with Mizal. So I was like, we
All
got it.
right.
And actually, when I, stress tested the name with my co-founders, they were like, oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. And it was the first time actually we had a kind of,
A
consensus on
good,
a,
a
on a
good,
name.
a good name. Yeah, yeah. You talk
Yes.
about co-founders. Who are your co-founders?
So right now we are two people, me and Fabien Forge, who is data analysis actually he was trained in economics, and so he's the CTO. And we previously had a very lengthy conversation with Nikita Roy to basically shape the project.
Okay, that's great. And just in a nutshell, what is your goal? What is the problem that you're trying to solve there?
Well, I would, explain it very simply by saying that Mizal is a kind of Spotify for ideas. And
All right.
the goal is that when you ask very important or, in-depth questions about something specialized, like let's say your work or, a topic of interest for you, if you ask it to these questions to ChatGPT or Claude, you will get some okay results. It could be very, generic, but it would be sound advice.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can tap into the knowledge of experts, then your answers become much more grounded, but also
Mm-hmm.
much more valuable. So let's imagine we're in, AI and journalism, and you're like, hey, how can I build interesting AI policy for my newsroom? Well,
Mm-hmm.
if you ask ChatGPT without Mizal, not sure about the result. If you ask ChatGPT with Mizal, then you will get perspectives from people who really thought about it carefully, who
Mm-hmm.
stumbled upon a few, errors and so on. And so the answers, which will become much more valuable. And we think it's really all about how do you build trust within these ecosystems of AI conversations. And today it's basically chatbots, but tomorrow it's probably will something more geared towards agents and autonomous content retrieval. So the trust layer will become much more
Super,
important,
super
we think.
important. Yeah.
Yes.
But then that is indeed, I can understand. I'm asking a question. I get either the average kind of intelligence and knowledge of the world, or I get specific, let's say, qualified intelligence. What is your business model? How can you make money with that kind of idea?
Well, we can make money in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
I think the first one, and it's going to be very interesting, especially for content creators.
Mm-hmm.
We think about it as a discoverability or conversion funnel. So you can have some general advice or discoverability format. So let's say we have, for example, we have a daily briefing for each article we are opening. So
Mm-hmm.
you have a daily briefing for tech, a daily briefing for journalism, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so you have access to content created by people on social
Mm-hmm.
media, for example. But then, if you want to go much more in depth with about a specific question, then you can pay for a more premium content, for example.
Okay.
And it's very interesting because we're seeing some new monetization mechanisms emerging within
Mm-hmm.
AI. So, the agent commerce protocol, the X402, for example. And so we can imagine maybe people will have kind of, wallets or something like that, or their agents will have some money they will be able to spend on very specific pieces of content, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And we also think on the opposite way, because to build Mizal, we need to build a trust layer. We need to be evaluate the credibility of each creator within their own space. And when, since we are building it, we quickly realized this is actually very valuable for a lot of organizations, especially, for example, in the news industry right now, there's a lot of discussions about do news organizations become more like music labels and they manage like, big signatures, they collaborate with creators and so on. And so since we are able to evaluate the credibility of these creators, it could be very valuable to news organizations, for example. So that's one of
Mm-hmm.
the streams
You're
we are looking at.
basically building a kind of a network of creators on the one hand, and so you do that at scale, and then you have to connect that with audiences that are somewhere in that conversational world, and that's how you try to build some kind of connection, and within that, take a share of the value exchange alongside. Is that kind of a summary?
That's a very good summary, indeed.
That's interesting, an interesting idea. But let's talk maybe about another interesting phenomenon, because the past couple of days, weeks, we've seen this kind of malt book and open cloud rapidly exploding, expanding, let's say, on different kind of outlets being talked about. For sure, I saw your LinkedIn post, and knowing you and following you, you've been experimenting almost on day one. How do you look at that phenomenon?
I think it's, it's both weird and fun, which, and as always with the technology, I think the best way to understand it is trying to engage with it. So yeah, open up an account, if you feel comfortable with understanding what are the, security risks and so on. But I think it raises two very interesting points. The first one is what a collaborative setup could look like for AI agent. I don't think Moldbook is the best illustration of that because we're starting to see a lot of interesting research and questions being raised about, is it really just AI agents, or do some humans try to sneak in
Who
and
is
sell you
behind?
some?
Who is behind?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And I think it's a mirror of first of society, because some people try to sell you some crypto scams on it, but it's also, I think, a mirror of our fears, because a lot of people were really hooked by, they're starting to discuss about creating a new language we can understand and so on. But at the end of the day, I think it's really a question of, okay, we will be in this world where agents will mediate a lot of information, they will take actions for us and so on. So how do you evaluate, first of all, that it's really an agent? How do you evaluate the level of trust you can have with this agent? Where does its expertise come from and so on? And what are their goals and etc. So it's really, you know, uh, I think it's also a good thing because it brings to a general public a not so distant future where agents collaborating together is a tangible thing, so people can gain at least, or they can start to think about it, even though again it's not maybe the right platform to imagine it, but yeah.
It's quite amazing. It's very experimental as well. Then I saw the other day a demo, or only this morning actually, of one of those open cloud agents that was basically tasked: can you order a meal or can you book a restaurant? And the only way to book a restaurant is a phone. And so that agent developed a phone calling agent, adapted a voice, and actually started initiating. And all of that was done by the agent. So the human was not in part, but then had to engage with the human, which is also interesting. The agent had to. So it's very early stage software, but very eye opening, and indeed to a degree also dangerous to see what the possible future could look like, not too far away. Now, if you think a bit about that experience that you've seen in that kind of open cloud mold book, and reflecting upon now what is the relevance for a news industry. If I'm a newsroom leader, what is the kind of implication of that, besides a great story that you can share?
Yes, indeed. I think, the main takeaway for me is that agents will consume content much more than humans. Actually, we're seeing some data points that show that they already consume more content than us. And so I think it's really a question of how do we move up the ladder individually and as a news organization, as an industry. And I think it's really a question of where will value creation will lie, and or will it shift or will it expand? I think it will explain basically because, if you are able to create content for agents consumption, then you can create basically monetization at scale, which could be very interesting. But on the other hand, I think it will also um, really highlight the importance of brands and connection, because I think, human connection will be more important than ever. And so how do you find the right balance between having a strong brand and a masthead, but also really like bringing your individual voices, your internal creators, journalists are creators basically. And so
Yeah.
how do you, put them on the spotlight so they can create more direct connection with their audiences? Wired is an interesting experiment for that, for example. And on the technical side, I think things will be much more complicated, because you will need to think about the dual format publishing as a mandatory thing, basically. So that's one aspect. You really need to think about your architecture. And I think it's also an interesting, canary in the coal mine signal that, when the mobile revolution emerged, we were still too much focused on, building nice desktop websites and so on. And today, I feel like we're still really too much focused on building experiments for humans, whereas we don't think enough about how do we architecture our content for machines, because we can create value from that. So I think
There's
this
a
has like the plus and
hypothesis
minus.
behind that, if you say that, because we can create value. So basically, underlying, you see a future where human created content consumed by machines is paid by machines. The value transfer happens from machine to human, and then maybe is exploited later on by the machines for other purposes again. So that is a sort of a future that you can envision
And I would say it's not a futuristic
of the
prediction.
future.
You can also already see a few glimpses of that. Like, for example, the Cloudflare negotiation mechanism is already something that aims at automating
Yeah,
negotiation between
changing.
agents and content. So,
Hmm.
and it's going to be very interesting, because how can an agent fix the value of a piece of content while negotiating with the other agent is going to be a tricky aspect of things. But still, if you have some trust signals, for example, well, the value of the content could be much more valuable.
Yes, that's as you said, it's probably not too far away a future. But if you look a little bit open cloud, written probably not, but by this Peter Steinberger. By the way, Peter Steinberger, very important for the publishing industry because he was the founder of PS PDF Kit, and that PDF viewer has been quite instrumental, also for Twipe. We've been a good customer. But he doesn't write software anymore. He talks. He creates software with his voice, and everything is open source. And you've been in that kind of, I would even being probably the hotbed of the open source ecosystem hugging phase. Share a little bit your experience with this open source community. What was so fascinating for you to be present?
I think it was really like being at the epicenter of open source AI
Mm-hmm.
and trying to articulate how it can be valuable, how it can be helpful for the news
Mm-hmm.
industry. And I think, the main takeaway for me is, well, we need to collaborate more as an industry, because, and by collaboration, I don't mean like, creating committees and so on. It's not that, but, I come from, for example, the data journalism,
Yeah. Angle.
experiment.
Yeah.
And I learned so much by just sharing code, reading other
Mm-hmm.
innovations, thinking questions,
Mm-hmm.
and so on. And today, the example I always give is, how many newsrooms tried to build their own transcription tool based on the same open source model, which is Whisper. And I'm like, why you don't create any additional value? It's not
Yeah.
like it will not give you any edge. And on the other hand, I haven't seen any newsroom being like, "Hey, we tried to build this. We will share it with the community. You can improve it. If you improve it, we will benefit from it actually." And I think we are too
So
much
basically, you say
focused.
co-creation of tools, sharing is not sitting in committees. That's basically what I understand that you would say this is a very good example. An open source community can reach a lot more than individuals. can reach.
You can compete on journalism, but not compete on the plumbing. I don't think it's interesting. And when you build together, it's an accelerator of innovation. And I think one of the keys actually that the news industry can use to accelerate their to basically thrive in this ecosystem is how do you accelerate innovation? That's crucial. Like you can think about incremental productivity gains and so on, but the real goal is how do you accelerate innovation and stay up to date with the pace of innovation within the broader ecosystem of AI, because basically AI is a foundational technology, so it will impact everything.
Yeah, yeah. Is there any reason why? Because my experience being in this industry now for the past 15 years is, to a degree, many publishers are, let's say, not competing heads on and are open to collaboration to a degree. You have some markets where they're heads on competing, but most publishers generally are able to share best practices in conferences and all of that. Still, I join you. You don't see a lot of co-creation. You see it, joint investigation journalism. Yes, you see that here and there happening, but co-creation, also, if we talk to customers, it's not natural. Any reason why? What is the inherent kind of blocker to a degree?
I would say two hypotheses on that.
Mm,
The first one is that basically a lot of news organizations see AI as a very, very competitive and age, so
mm,
they might don't want to collaborate on this. The
mm,
second aspect is maybe that
mm,
the overall technical level of skills within the industry it needs to be higher. And so if you ramp up your internal skills, maybe you will be more eager to share what you learn from your experiments.
mm.
That's one potential area of interest, I think. But it's I mean, again, it's really about how do you lift up all the boats, and open source is basically all about lifting up all the boats.
And if you look at it more also on the open source, what is your point of view on the geopolitical angle? You have the a bit black and white, the Silicon Valley protection, let's make America great, but we keep it for ourselves, definitely don't share. And then the Chinese kind of approach where basically everything is open sourced, not a lot of, let's say, attention on copyright protection. I would even say the opposite. If we can steal it and remake it and faster, we're all benefiting from that. What's your point of view? Because you've seen a lot of that happening, and where's the world heading? Are the open source models going to win, or are the more proprietary models going to win? How do you look at that?
I think it will be a very complex mix of different things.
Mm,
But the most important question, I think, is that AI is basically a cultural technology. And so, we can see it in many, many different European countries, for example, where you might want to use an American or a Chinese model, but basically it wasn't trained on Norwegian, for example. I was in Oslo a few
language.
months ago, and we stumbled upon a lot of blockers because of that. And so
Mm-hmm,
for the news industry, it might be very interesting to think about, hey, we are basically meaning making organizations. We shape worldviews, and
mm-hmm,
we can basically shape how models will think about values, society, events. And so it's really not so much about being a customer of AI technologies, but more like, hey, what should we build? And again, how can we collaborate on that? The Scandinavian countries, the Nordic countries are very interesting for that, because they think about how can we share a pool of resources so that the tools are being better for us and for the society, because the private sector can use it also, and so on. So it's I think it's all about being relevant to the AI ecosystem today.
okay, very interesting. Interesting. Now, you've also been quite explicit from the different things that we could hear and listen and read from you on, let's say, the future of the news industry and how. And so you can see some big publishers, big brands thrive and even grow. And then you can see big tech platforms that will take a piece of the cake on how people will kind of consume or be informed. But then you say some people risk to be stuck in the middle or too small. what's your advice? But you must have been asked that question many times. What's your advice for mid-sized publishers these days? What should they do?
I would say two things. Two archetypes. Like basically, you can really go all in on premium voice-laden brands,
Mm-hmm,
and it's really like how do you still keep this connection, and people will be willing to pay for it, especially in an AI-mediated ecosystem, because they will want to sift through the noise. And the
mm-hmm.
second possibility, which is probably a little bit more complex for just a one organization, especially a middle-sized
Yeah,
organization,
yeah, yeah.
is basically betting on a more like distribution platform. Like you basically bet on the pipes, and it's all about APIs, data set, fact-checking services, and so on. Um, I think in both cases, what's interesting is that basically we can really think about how do you unbundle the artifacts from the value you create. And so I don't think it's all about being obsessed, or the workflow being only about how do you create articles or videos. It's much more
Mm-hmm,
about, okay, where do we create value and how can we distribute it? And I think when you come back to these two very important questions, you can have a much more deeper conversation about what the future of each news organization, where does the future of each organization lie
mm-hmm,
actually. So yeah.
mm-hmm. And if you've been looking into the AI space, and the key question that comes back and back again, what is the role of the human in the, let's say, the broader uh, journalistic workflow, if I can say, from the identification of what is relevant to the reporting, to the interpretation, to the distribution? Where do you see still today, tomorrow, and in 5 years the unique role of the human in that process?
Well, I think the start of 2026 is very interesting for that, because I think we're really moving from chatbots to assistants, which is basically moving from toys to tools. And we need to become better at managing agents. So as a journalist, as an
Mm-hmm,
editor, and so on, you're like, okay, I have this set of really, really powerful collaborators that I can
mm-hmm,
use to do my work. Am I able to manage them correctly? Am I able to spot their errors and so on? And I think, in journalism, the human in the loop value is actually fundamental.
mm-hmm,
But we need to think about this value in details, because AI is all about scale. And so when you can produce content at scale, or when you can sift through many databases and so on, how do you keep the human in the loop is a kind of very complex questions. Actually, is it spot checks or that kind of approach? Can be much more complex than just saying, yeah, we will have human in the loops always. I think it can be very complicated for that. And another question is, how do you basically upskill your newsrooms? And I think we don't think enough about it, because being a journalist today is about talking to people, asking questions, and
mm-hmm.
writing something in 3-5 years. It could
Different.
be very, very different than today.
Mm-hmm. And in that context, if you would have to make one choice as a senior leader of a newsroom, what is the one thing to focus on that, according to you, in 5 years from now, will have moved the needle in this kind of emerging, very chaotic, difficult to navigate? What would be your advice? This is the most important thing to now do with the organization.
I'm not sure if there is one thing, but I would say it's
Mm-hmm,
maybe one key actually that I can really see as a bottleneck within news
mm-hmm,
organizations today is, how do you rethink the collaboration between the newsroom and the IT
mm-hmm,
department? Because
mm-hmm,
actually, and let's think about, for example, vibe coding. A
mm-hmm,
journalist can have super interesting ideas on, front end ideas, back end ideas, and so on. But sometimes you're still fighting to get a few licenses on
mm-hmm.
this general product that anybody outside of the organization is already using. So I think it's that kind of conversation is very, very important. And also, how do you internalize the skills needed to basically build on top of AI? And this is actually where open source is interesting, because you have to engage again with the technology instead of just, plugging an account or an API key. So I think it's very important. And the third aspect is maybe how do you build community as infrastructures? Because I think readers, we need to find a path where we can innovate with our audience without breaking the trust contract that we have with them. And it's a very tricky balance, because
It is.
for news, trust is everything. But if you have to wait for a product to be perfect before shipping it, it's impossible, because you need to learn from the feedback and from how people use your product, actually. So how can you build that kind of path with them is going to be very important. And so they can understand what's at stake and feel that they have a say on, your product development could be very important. And the third aspect, I think, is thinking about conversational interfaces as the default approach. So if you're able to think about your content and how do we make it accessible, distributed, but also interesting in a conversational setup, I think you will really unlock something, and it would be much more interesting than just shoveling your articles within a database and hope for the best, because
Interesting.
that's not how these
No,
tools and
that's
interfaces are built.
no. On the conversational part, we've also developed prototypes, conversational news interfaces. We've exchanged with customers. We've exposed readers with it, and we've progressively learned the last year that, to a degree, news is for many people a lean back experience, and they still expect in their brains a kind of well formatted, structured format that they recognize, which is, let's say, the opposite of a conversation almost, which is very much lean forward, interactive, curious, engaging. Do you see that moving fast, that kind of from a lean back to a lean forward, interactive, engaging experience? How do you look at that?
I think the two modes will always cohabitate. If when you're in a chatbot today, your core need is knowledge. So you're really active with the content. And actually, it's very interesting. I think this week, OpenAI released a very interesting data point that they basically register 1 million conversational queries about local news in the US, I think. But the way people ask questions to ChatGPT is not, hey, give me the latest news about X and Y. It's, hey, can you tell me more about this storm coming to my city, for example? And then ChatGPT decides, hey, I'll tap into Axios content, for example. And so it's really, again, how do you make your content surfaceable, retrievable within these ecosystems? And it's really also a very interesting question of how do you design products in a way that you don't put the cognitive load on the users, because sometimes, and we all rushed into like building chatbots, for example, and people are like, I don't know what to ask, so they didn't use it. Whereas if you guide them, for example, it's much more engaging, much more interesting. And so, yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting. But again, especially for mid-sized newsrooms, it's complicated because it's basically an addition to what you're already doing and what you're already building. So I think if we take a step back, one important question is, we can't do everything. So what are our bets? What are our theses? And basically just focus on that is important.
Very interesting conclusion of the discussion here, Florent. Thanks so much for the conversation. Human to human still. Maybe in the future will be human to agent or agent to human, who knows? But I'm really very grateful for having you here with us, spending the time. I'm wishing you all the best with Mizal. You are on a nice adventure there. And so for the people listening now, thank you for listening. We hope you could also kind of learn more from Florent's experiences at Hugging Face, but also before in Newsroom and now as an entrepreneur. Thanks a lot, and we hope to see you or hear you back in any one of our our next episodes. Bye bye.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and feel free to join the waitlist on Mizal.ai.